Julia. I always, of course, use pseudonyms and don't give, geographic details or anything. But he wanted me to meet her. And so I did one day. And there were three aspects of the case that were just incredibly amazing. First of all, the priests who were involved with her, there were two major priests. There weren't very many exorcists in America at the time. And so I got to know them. Actually, they became good friends of mine, and they would take me all over the country on cases. So I began to develop a tremendous amount of experience as a psychiatric consultant. And they told me before I even met her that she already had been evaluated by some mental health people and that they had no doubt that this was a classic possession. In fact, they described her as a once-in-a-century case. Mm-hmm. It was such a flamboyant possession, which I'll get into. So it was an amazing possession, indicative in some ways of her Satanist background. Number two, she revealed to me, I wouldn't say reluctantly, but she was expected to reveal to me all about her involvement with the cult. So I had this unique perspective hearing the stories about a rare satanic cult. And again, I want to emphasize, amidst the satanic panic at the time, I was not a believer or still believe that there's a lot of these satanic cults. But here I was seeing the real deal. Finally, and she revealed it because she was expected to reveal it by the priest. They said, look, we want to explore, and we want this psychiatrist, psychoanalyst to explore why you're so ambivalent about getting help when you yourself know you're possessed. And then what I say is the third amazing aspect of the case is, she treated me fairly respectfully. In fact, she treated me better than she treated the priest. And I think she was intrigued by getting my opinion as a doctor. Again, she knew very well that she was possessed, but she wanted my perspective on it. And she actually said to me towards the end, and I won't reveal the ending of the story yet, but she told me eventually that I could tell her story. I could tell it openly. I wasn't to use her name or any details about where the cult existed or anybody she knew in the cult, but I could tell her story and that I could tell it in any medium. So I always had the idea I would write about it. I did write about it for a periodical. It became a famous case on the internet. People can just Google Julia, the Satanic Queen. Mm-hmm. And then when HarperCollins asked me to write the book, I included it prominently in the book. And surprisingly, Hollywood, well, perhaps not surprisingly, Hollywood got interested in this story as well. So I'm sure many people in your audience know who Jason Blum is. And Jason Blum spoke to me at one point and said, Dr. Gallagher, this is the hottest intellectual property I've ever seen, and we want to make a movie out of it. Will you participate? So there will be a movie about this case probably in a year or two. Let me just read a couple of incidents from my getting to know her. The first short incident from the book, I'll read fast.
Take your time. We're okay.
I'm a native New Yorker, so I tend to talk fast anyway. And this is the beginning of chapter 3, Julia, the Satanic Queen, her possession and her remarkable abilities. And by her remarkable abilities, I mean this woman had, as a Satanist, and she said, I only have it because I'm a Satanist. Yeah. She felt she had been granted, bestowed by Satan himself, her master, with certain amazing psychic abilities. So unlike some cases where you see kind of the fireworks, you see the victim, I'll call them victims. you see the victim speaking, foreign languages or, exhibiting all kinds of hidden knowledge. Often that is primarily seen during the exorcisms, and I've been to many, many exorcisms in my life as an observer. But in her case, she had these psychic abilities even outside of when she was kind of manifesting the demonic voice, which also her.
One of the things that stuck with me, Julia was my favorite, story in the book. And the thing that stuck with me the most was the interaction with your cats, which I hope you read about.
You're reading my mind.
Okay.
So I will start with that story. It's how I met her.
Okay.
And I expected to meet her from Father Jacques' request to me in my office at some point. And lo and behold, he brings her to my house, which I was very annoyed about, and he apologized later. And I said, look, Father Jacques, do not bring Satanists to my neighborhood. Anyway, this is the story, and includes the night before. So I say, the night before I met Julia, something unnerving happened. My family loves animals, and at that time, a French bulldog and 2 cats prowled around our house like long-time relatives. All 3 always got along well. The cats often curled up next to each other on our bed at night. So one night around 3 a.m., loud screeching sounds startled me and my wife out of our sleep. Our 2 normally docile cats were going at it like champion prize fighters, smacking and clawing at each other, intent on inflicting serious harm to each other. My wife grabbed the female cat and I held on to the male. We separated them into 2 different rooms as they continued to growl and bristle. My wife and I then got back into bed, quite mystified. We wrote off the tiff between the 2 cats as perhaps caused by some bad cat food or one too many sniffs of catnip. So it was the next morning that Father Jacques rang our home's doorbell. He was standing on our front door with the woman I called Julia. Julia was dressed in black pants with a dark purple blouse hanging loosely around her slight frame. I guess she was in her late 30s or early 40s. Her short hair was dyed jet black, and her black eyeliner extended around to her temples. This was a style I later learned was favored by her fellow female cult members. Father Jacques was dressed as always in his rumpled clerics, and he had his hands in his pockets. He seemed to be avoiding eye contact with me. I think he was a little hesitant that he had brought her to the house. And he said to me, "This is Julia, and she has something to confess." Now, remember, I had never met this woman before. Mm-hmm. So Julia gazed at me and with a smirk asked, "Nice to meet you, Dr. Gallagher. How did you like those cats last night?" I'd never had contact with this woman before. I stared at her. I was taken aback as much by her manner as by her astonishing statement. She regarded me with a kind of smug smile, evidently pleased with herself. I couldn't help but blurt out, and what are you amused about? I'm not amused. Her smile even widened as she leaned against the door frame. "Look," I finally thought to say, "I respect Father Jacques. He asked me to see you. But let's not have a repeat of last night, understand?" My thoughts came fast and furious. What the hell am I saying? Could she really have anything to do with the cats? So that was my introduction to her.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after complaining to Father Jacques about her bringing her to the house, Julia to the house, I really came to know Julia very well. And as I said, she actually, maybe she was slightly apologetic, but she always treated me very respectfully and honestly. And she told me she had all these remarkable powers. Anybody in the audience who knows something about parapsychology knows that, there are these claims of people to be clairvoyant. And in particular, there's something that parapsychologists call remote viewing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit similar to astral projection in the sense of it's people who claim they can see things at a distance. So Julia had told me that she could do that. And then I challenged her one day then when she was sitting in my office and she said, I can see the chief exorcist. This was a guy who was an ex-Marine, even bigger than I am, and I'm a very big guy. He was about 6'7". He was an ex-Marine, and he was the chief exorcist. And she always told me that the Satanists hated him. He even packed a pistol. He was allowed to carry a pistol. The local police used to use him as a consultant, although he told me once that he was never going to use that pistol. But anyway, she said that she could see. He called him. It was kind of a nom de guerre, Father A. And just as early as she had told me that she had seen the office of a Jesuit psychiatrist who had previously evaluated her, who she didn't like. And what I gathered was she was talking by seeing that it was a very powerful image in her head rather than something she literally saw with her eyes. But she said, I can describe him. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. So I said, I had enough of a relationship with her then that I said, okay, Miss Smarty Pants, you tell me, and then I'm going to call him. So, I said, it seems impossible. What are you talking about? So she calmly claimed, well, I see him in a blue windbreaker. I'm reading from the book. I see him in a blue windbreaker and khakis. He's walking along the seashore near where he lived. Now, he was about 100 miles away. She had never been to his house, and she knew nothing about where he lived. She happened to have a term for this ability. She called it her projections. Those in the audience who know mental health know we use the word projection of paranoid patients, but she was using in her idiosyncratic way. So I immediately called Father A on his cell phone, and I asked where he was and what he was wearing. He told me, I'm usually at the rectory at this hour, but I decided to take a walk tonight. I'm saying my breviary along the shore. And I said, what are you wearing? He said, my khaki pants and a blue and a windbreaker. I said, what color is your windbreaker? He said, who wants to know? But he picked up what was going on. He said, you must be talking to Julia, right? Rich, she's something else. So, this was the ability that is called remote viewing, and she had these psychic abilities. I don't exactly want to call her a witch, but she was very like a witch,
Mm-hmm.
Who also claim witchly powers. And again, just as in the 19th century, in the 1600s and 1700s, there was a lot of hysteria about witches. There often historically is exaggeration about it, but witches do exist, and a lot of societies still not only believe in them, but sometimes put them to death. Somebody was telling me the other day about a case in Morocco that was like that. Let me just finish my reading from the book, Arshia. by talking a little bit about the exorcism. The exorcism
Please do.
were tremendously dramatic. I was invited to go to this one that turned out to be the last one. I've been to many exorcisms in my, observation over the years, but I never made it to hers. So this is basically based on the accounts of about 8 other people who were at the exorcism, including 2 nurses, the 2 priests, and some other people. And Father A was really the one who recounted to me what the exorcism was like. He gave me a long list of the more dramatic phenomena he had encountered during this last exorcism. The demon or demons frequently writhed in pain upon any contact with holy water that he sprinkled on Julia, yelling, "Stop, it burns." On the other hand, Julia had never had any reaction to tap water during any earlier assessment, though her possessing spirit, of course, would not have been told which water had been blessed. During the rituals, including this one, Father A told me, the demon often spoke in several foreign languages that Julia clearly didn't know. According to the other exorcist, Father Jacques, who knew the language well, the demon spoke very articulate Latin. At some point during this last ritual, the room became distinctly frigid, and then the temperature spiked drastically, making the room stifling hot. Father A said, "Rich, I felt like I was at the gates of hell." Now, with a possessed female, Father A always had women to hold the victim down, in part to preempt, any charge of misconduct. On this night, the 2 invited nuns and another lay nurse had their hands directly on Julia's shoulder and arms, ready to grab her if she struck out. What a skilled exorcist has to do is take charge and make sure that the person is held down. Obviously, this had been done with Julia's consent, because otherwise the victim will try to run away or attack. And at some point, Julia tried to grab Father A's stole around his neck. Fortunately, she was restrained. And basically, everyone told me they wondered how Julia could sustain this immense strength over 2 full hours. And then Father A continued, "It happened." "What happened?" I asked. She said, "Julia levitated right out of her chair for about a half an hour." Now, all the other witnesses later corroborated the story to me that Julia had visibly risen about a foot off the chair, and in the clear impression of all attendees, would have ascended higher if it hadn't been for those present, including several men holding her down. Later, one witness commented to me, "Dr. Gallagher, I'm sure she would have gone to the ceiling if we hadn't stopped it." Was an attempt to escape or to scare the participants? It's hard to say, but everyone was shaken. Now, these levitations are even much rarer, although they have been reported in history and certain other spiritual figures and spiritualists. I have talked, Arshia, during the course of my life, including to a European professor, of about 35 people who have seen a levitation during a possession. I've never seen one myself, and I think they're extremely rare, but in these more dramatic cases, they happen. Now, people ask me, and I'll make this quick, get on to the questions, so what happened with Julia?
Yeah.
You see, Julia was a classic example of someone who wanted to have her cake and eat it too. So she knew she was possessed. She wanted to be free of the possession, and she kind of wanted to regard the exorcisms as sort of a magic ceremony that would rid her of the possession. At the same time, she not only didn't want to leave the cult, she claimed at one point she was in love with the male leader of the cult.
Mm-hmm.
But she also was afraid if she would leave the cult, that they would come after her. and harm her. So she was a little bit betwixt and between. And, we had to tell her, and I told her myself, look, Julia, you can't go around participating in a satanic cult as well as, still praying to Satan, which she admitted to me she was still doing. You can't do both. And she said, well, Satan, I know, this God you believe in, I don't know him. And she eventually decided she couldn't continue. And so she was never delivered. And, that's the way it is. I mean, you can't be delivered if you're worshiping Satan and, not renouncing your nefarious ways. So right. that was the end of the story. Spoiler alert for anybody who reads the book or sees the movie.
Man, that is harrowing. I've never heard of anything like that. And the fact that there were so many witnesses, it's just fascinating.
I was a witness to a number of her paranormal powers.
Right.
I saw her go into a trance. She called the priest at one point, the demon called the priest a monkey priest, which is a very good indication of how they think about evil spirits regard us as stupid animals. And quite frankly, compared to their intelligence, we're not very intelligent.
Yeah. I remember at one point in the book, you had mentioned that she had told you how your mother had passed, which was knowledge that most people don't have, which,
nobody really knew it, except for, my family and that, and it had happened years earlier.
Yeah.
She knew all kinds of things. It's called in Latin, latra, and that along with superhuman strength, speaking foreign languages. These are some of the classic signs, let alone levitation. These are some of the classic signs that a foreign spirit is there. And I don't say all cases of possession have all those features. Hers did. It was very, very clear she was possessed, although you have to see some indication of some of this paranormal stuff to know that, no human being could imitate this. It had to come from a demon. And that's one of the reasons, I get involved in these cases to assess, could this be a psychiatric disorder like a dissociative identity disorder we used to call multiple personality or psychosis, or is there enough evidence that, this is clearly beyond that? As I say to people, Arshia, mental patients don't levitate, they don't speak perfect Latin. So, you can make the distinction once you know all the facts of the case.
Certainly. Let's chat about that a little bit. That was one of the questions I had, is how do you distinguish, psychosis from possession? Are there more indicators?
Well, there's a lot of indicators. I mean, the gist of it is you have to look at the totality of the case. You have to find clear evidence. And this is in the, in the Catholic manual that goes back centuries. The exorcist, who ultimately is responsible for the ultimate decision, the exorcist has to be certain. It's called morally certain that a demon is involved. This is not just depression or psychosis or something. So, I'm in a good position as a very experienced psychiatrist of recognizing that certain people who may be psychotic, who may have schizophrenia, who may have multiple personality, or just a super active imagination, may think they're possessed and are not.
Right.
I can tell those individuals. In order to diagnose a true possession, and there are lesser forms of demonic attack too, which we call oppression, but in order to diagnose a possession, you really have to see some of these major signs that a foreign entity, an evil spirit, is present, and you in part discern that by different things. Part of it is taking a history and seeing if it's plausible that this person could have gotten possessed, because not everybody is going to be prone to getting possessed, obviously, but also have they exhibited any of these, what's called preternatural, the modern world would say paranormal powers, that, can only be exhibited by something more than human. So you take the totality of the evidence. You have to know the case well enough to cite the evidence.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. And you mentioned being prone to attacks, and that was something that I was kind of curious about. So are there conditions that might lead to demonic interference in someone's life? Are particular people more vulnerable than others? Like, can this happen to anyone? I'm curious about that.
It will normally not happen to anyone. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, normally, especially, quite frankly, if people lead decent lives and, have a good faith, it absolutely will not happen to them. The people who get involved are the people like Julia who have turned to evil, and whether explicitly or not.
Mm.
I dealt with a guy who was a gangster once, and, he was a drug lord. Now, he had also turned to Santa Muerte, which is a Mexican-American sort of dark cult.
Mm.
People who turn to something dark in occultism and or very evil practices, those are the people who get possessed.
Mm.
And in some ways, wittingly or unwittingly, they've invited the demonic force in. And the demons are like the mafia. Once they've done a favor for you, they believe they own you. They do not want to let you go. And in a way, they feel Julia clearly felt she had these psychic abilities as a favor from Satan. And again, it's like working with the mafia. They do you a favor, they own you. And that's the way the evil spirits treat people who are possessed. They own that person. It's very tragic, obviously.
Yeah.
Sort of a literal Faustian bargain,
Yeah, literally. And beyond that, in Julia's case, it sounded like the cult owned her as well, because she was afraid to leave it. She was afraid of what might happen. So in her case,
yeah, she was afraid of the cult. There's no doubt about it. So,
yeah.
and I could understand. The reason she was referred to me was because she had this tremendous conflict. What was she going to do?
Right.
The priest, who knew she was possessed already. In fact, there were several other mental health people some of whom I knew, who had seen her before I did. And everybody thought she was possessed. It wasn't just me. And, again, I don't want to give the people the impression I'm the only psychiatrist who believes in this stuff. I'm just probably the one who's seen the most. And my chairman used to say, who was a very prominent psychiatrist, that I may have seen more of these cases than any other doctor in history. So I figured, since I have so much experience, I should be a little more public about it. And that's another reason I wrote the book.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you did. It was a fascinating read. We definitely have audience questions, but I would like to ask one more of my own. And it kind of is sort of like a question someone had asked. And that was, do exorcisms and demonic possessions exist outside of the Catholic faith? And I think we chatted about this a little bit. How do they exist within other cultures and other faiths? Obviously, I'm Pakistani, but I still remember my grandmother telling me about jinn and like similar things. So what are your thoughts on possession and exorcism?
Yeah, sometimes you will hear, there's sort of the professional skeptics, I call them. They say, oh, how come this only happens to like fundamentalist Christians or something? Mm-hmm. Nothing but could be further from the truth. Mm-hmm. These possessions happen in every culture. Now, again, they're rare. Mm-hmm. And the conceptual framework for understanding them is going to be different. Mm-hmm. My book was just translated into Japanese. Mm-hmm. It's also been translated into Spanish and Polish. And, these different cultures have different ways of explaining this stuff, but they all believe in evil spirits. And then the question is, what exactly is an evil spirit? Could it be a dead souls? Mm. For centuries, Jewish folklore believed in Dybbuk, which were dead souls, which were a little vengeful and malicious. In the Catholic tradition, and I am a Catholic, we tend to think that demons, I have a lot of stories illustrating this point. We tend to think that demons in most cultures have lied. They pretend to be all kinds of things. They pretend to be dead souls. Sometimes they pretend to be exalted gods and goddesses. So the cultural interpretation will be different. But what we find, and I've been to quite a few exorcisms, is in the church eventually forces them to reveal who they really are. Mm-hmm. And they always admit to being a demon. Getting back to your question about, transcultural, probably the magnum opus of a early German professor who originally was kind of a Freudian and then came to become an early believer in parapsychology. This is in the early 20th century. He wrote a mammoth book. His name was Professor Osterreich, and he wrote a book called Demoniacal Possession in Antiquity, in foreign cultures, and in the West. Mm-hmm. And he gives literally, again, these are rare, but he gives literally thousands of references to possessions in all cultures, Hindu cultures, pagan cultures, agnostic cultures, Muslim cultures, and in the Muslim religion, they believe in evil spirits and possessions and often send people to the imam. So he concludes that a lot of these features, even if different cultures interpret them differently, sometimes, Muslim beliefs is pretty similar to Christian beliefs, that these are fallen angels, but some cultures have a different conceptualization. And he says, nevertheless, transculturally, they all share a lot of common features. Mm. And, that book, by the way, influenced William Peter Blatty about The Exorcist, because he not only based the Exorcist movie, which some people are going to see, I've seen it a number of times, I've seen it enough, but he not only based it on a case of a boy from Maryland, and there's an ongoing dispute about whether he was possessed or not. I think he was, but he based it very much on that case. But he also based it on cases he learned about from Osterreich's book, including the character of the priest who eventually, again, spoiler alert, this time I'll refrain from saying, but the priest in the book is based on a character from a very, very famous case in France, Loudun. Aldous Huxley wrote the book, The Devils of Loudun. It was about a nunnery that had possession. And the priest who got involved, was sort of, something tragic happened to him, which people who see the movie will see the fictional version of. The movie is fictional, but it's based on not only this real case from Maryland of this 13, 14-year-old boy, but it's also based on the Loudun case. Well, I used to live in France and I played semi-pro basketball right near the city of Loudun. There's a modern city. So I heard a lot about this case. And over the years, I've also talked to some of the advisors to the case. So I'm pretty knowledgeable about the case that led Blatty to write the book, and then, which was also enormously successful. And eventually the movie that is described as the scariest, as well as the most successful horror movie of all time.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Speaking of children, we have some questions from the audience about children in possession. But before I ask you, I just want to reach out to the folks in the theater, in the Ron Robinson Theater, to let you know that you can also ask questions. So feel free to ask. But from here on Zoom, we've got a question from Lisa, and she says, she's curious about your experience with children and possession. Do you feel like they are more or less vulnerable, maybe, than adults?
Well, I feel children are less vulnerable because I don't think they normally themselves would have turned to dark forces or, nefarious or criminal or very sinful behavior. Mm-hmm. There are some of these cases. I think they're very, very rare, In the case of this 14-year-old boy, he's a teenager, maybe more than a child, but he had fooled around with spiritualism. People can get a little hysterical about a Ouija board, but he took a Ouija board very seriously because he had an aunt who was a spiritualist. And, she claimed that she was in contact with dead souls.
Mm.
The mainstream religions have usually condemned that type of spiritualism, summoning spirits. You're not supposed to summon spirits.
Mm.
One of the ways people do summon spirits, and it's why there is some truth to the warnings about a Ouija board, is when people use a Ouija board, if they use it seriously as opposed to just joking around with it, they are attempting to summon a spirit. It is believed that the kid, who has been identified in recent years as a real person, the young man who was originally called by different pseudonyms, now we know who it really was. He died recently. He was attempting to use the Ouija board to contact his dead aunt. He was very close to her. And somehow, the phrase that some people use is, when you play around with these occult forces, you pay a price, you open a door. Now, there is some still dispute about whether he was possessed. My own review of the case, and I talked to several advisors who again, are mostly deceased now, but who told me about the case, some details of the case. The people who really know this case, in my opinion, the best, including the priest who was the chief exorcist, who had a diary about it that was eventually published. They think he was possessed, and I do too. There were just too many features suggestive of a possession. Having said that, there are some people who still challenge that view. He clearly had. He originally was Lutheran, and his Lutheran minister brought him into his house because he wanted to observe this. And supposedly 49 people saw a lot of bizarre stuff, like psychokinetic stuff, strange noises, bed moving, stuff, some of which made it into the movie. 49 witnesses saw something that was clearly paranormal. So at least there was something, in my opinion, seriously demonic. And my hypothesis, I after speaking to people, although it's true that I obviously never met the case, I tend to believe the people who say he was possessed. Yeah.
Interesting. Couple more questions for you. This, and I apologize if I say your name wrong. This is from Sum or Sum, and it goes back to the question about culture. And they ask, while every culture may have records of these events, the way to deliver them of this affliction varies greatly. To whom do these people plead? On whose authority? Can you speak to maybe the rites that other cultures might practice and how they might differ from Catholicism?
Well, in Catholicism and in the Orthodox Church and the Protestant Church, you're talking about, altogether, at least a third of the human race. The teaching is quite clear that we're dealing with fallen angels, that for sadistic reasons, they hate God and they hate human beings, and, that they act through the authority of God. Or in the Christian religion, they would say, also our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, the Muslims, honor Jesus, but they tend to do the exorcisms through the power of Allah. So the general view of most, certainly of the monotheistic cultures, is that it's by the power of God or Allah. Other cultures will feel that there is something that a holy person, has some ability to ask divine help according to that culture for help, and they'll sometimes get results. I have to say that I've seen people in all cultures, and it's going to sound very chauvinistic of me to say, I do think the best results have been in the Catholic and Orthodox churches. But I'm not saying, you and I had talked about a woman in Pakistan who turned to her imam, who I think was a very good holy man, who prayed to Allah to deliver her, and she claimed at least partial success.
Very interesting.
That answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic answer. Last one here. This is from George. Do your observations of the actions of the adherents to these demonic and evil forces logically compel you the coexistence of angelic and godly forces?
Well, again, the Catholic teachings, which I accept. I mean, in some ways, I think it's validated by my experiences, although obviously people debate these things. I believe that demons had free choice. Human beings have free choice too, but demons had free choice, and they could have either followed God or not. And they chose to rebel. And they chose not to follow God's guidance and wisdom, however you want to phrase it. And so, we don't know too much about it, but we know that they, you might say, self-exiled themselves. So they are estranged from God, which is their biggest self-imposed punishment. It presupposes, of course, that there were other angels who did not rebel. And yes, I believe very strongly in angels. And I think some people have claimed to see angels. Certainly, different religions, not just Christianity, claim there are good spirits and angels too. And I certainly accept that teaching.
Makes sense. Well, we've discussed a lot tonight. I'm going to say this is the last question. I had one more that I forgot about. And that is, we discussed The Exorcist. However, I would like to ask you, in your line of work, what your favorite scary movie is. Maybe one that really, really scares you.
It was nominated for the Academy Award, by the way. I mean, it didn't win the Academy Award, although it won it for screenplay and sound effects. I thought when she speaks this vile language, which she did, which the boy also did, and when she had this projectile vomiting and then levitated, I mean, it was pretty disgusting, but it was pretty well done.
Yeah.
Supposedly, they had some kind of machine that vomited, and it was supposed to vomit on Jason Miller, who played the priest, on his chest, and it must have malfunctioned a little bit. It vomited on his face. It was actually pea soup, and he was horrified. And so Friedkin, who was the director, said, "We're keeping that scene. It's exactly what I was looking for." So that was kind of my favorite scene in a slightly horrific, disgusting way.
Excellent. Pea soup, delicious.
Was pea soup, yeah.
All right. Well, do you have anything else you would like to add, Dr. Gallagher? Anything that we may not have mentioned or discussed?
Well, I guess the question that always comes up to me as a psychiatrist is, how does it feel to be out of the mainstream? And I say to people, what mainstream are you talking about? Throughout history, most people have believed in evil spirits. Throughout the world today, most people believe in evil spirits. In America, most people believe in the devil and evil spirits. I don't see myself in the mainstream. I see myself as who tries to understand this as scientifically possible, as scientifically as I can, just because things are historical, I use the example of Washington crossing the Delaware. I mean, that's historical, but pretty much everybody believes it because there's good evidence for it. And I think the kind of things I write about, and I have a million stories, including many in the book, I think there's very good evidence. So I don't see this as unscientific in any way. In fact, the better church traditions and religions are very rigorous about these diagnoses, and the diagnoses can be said in their totality to represent a certain syndrome. So I regard myself as a man of science. I'm not a creationist. I believe in the Big Bang. I believe in evolution. But I also believe that there are these spiritual forces in the universe. And, we get a glimpse of it through, unfortunately, some of these tragedies.
Yeah. Well said. It looks like, before I let you go, it looks like there might be a question in the audience. Nathan, do you want to read off that question?
May I ask the question?
Absolutely.
I'm present here.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Sorry,
I have two,
didn't know you were
actually.
here.
Dr.
Hello.
Gallagher, prior to your involvement in this field, were you at all skeptical that possession really existed? And if you were, what did it take to change your mind? That's question one. Question two is, in the course of all the exorcisms you've witnessed, did you ever feel personally endangered?
Surprisingly not, to the latter question. I mean, I feel, Nathan, and I'm not professing myself to be a paragon or anything, but I feel a little protected, by my faith and all that. And I have people praying for me. In fact, I'm going to shamelessly ask your audience to pray for me, those so inclined. So I feel I have a certain protection. I'm not foolish about it. In terms of how I got involved, I was brought up Catholic, so I thought that these things conceivably could happen. But I thought they were extremely rare. And I also did think that some of them were misconceptions of epilepsy or something like that the ancient people didn't understand. In fact, when the priest first came to me, this is the Father Jacques, I told him, I said, look, Father, I've just finished my residency at Yale. I'm kind of skeptical of this stuff. And he said to me, well, then you're the perfect man for the job. And as I then became more and more experienced, obviously, my skepticism decreased. Now, that doesn't mean that I jumped to that conclusion. Quite the contrary, I do not. I'm at heart, I'm still a little bit of a skeptic, and I need a lot of evidence. But yes, you can understand from my vantage point that I've become fairly convinced by now by the evidence. So thank you, Nathan and Arshia, for great questions. Thank you to Brad for inviting me, and it was a pleasure to be involved in such an intelligent discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Gallagher. And thank you to the gentleman in the audience whose name I did not catch. That was a great question. Two great questions. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This was wonderful. And thank you for supporting the Six Bridges Book Fest. Libraries are great. Please support your library. We hope you stick around for more sessions this weekend. I think there's 2 more days of the Book Fest. And we appreciate your support. And if you enjoyed the program and would like to support CALS, feel free to make a donation or write a review on Google or whatever you want to do to support your library. Thank you guys so much and enjoy the movie. Bye.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.